That's good. Hello, yes, welcome to Degrowth, a podcast. My name is Nico. I'm gonna be your host today. So please can you introduce yourself and tell us where you are, what you do.
Hi, Nico. My name's Kate Chambers. I live just outside Edinburgh in Midlothian, and I'm really excited to be with you today talking about degrowth and decolonisation. My background, I currently work as a circular economy consultant. So what that means, it's one of those jobs where you say I'm a consultant and people are like, what does that actually mean? But basically, I help clients to look at new economic models. So moving away from a linear economic model, thinking about taking natural resources from the earth, using them to make products and then disposing of them at end of life. What I'm trying to do with the organisation that I work for, Resource Futures, is move towards a circular model where we keep resources in use for as long as possible. So really trying to move to an economic system that operates within our planetary boundaries, because as we both know, we've got a finite amount of resources on planet Earth. And at the rate that we're going at, we're exploiting them very, very seriously and putting humankind, our ecosystems at a lot of risk. So that's kind of where I come to this degrowth conversation is from an environmental point of view.
Thank you. Okay, straight to question number one. Yes. So good. Question number one, how would you explain or describe a degrowth in Scotland, decolonization to people who are listening right now or in the future?
I think the terms degrowth and decolonisation, even for me to say them, are difficult. So I know how people feel when they hear them and they just think, what does that even mean? But for me, as I said, I've kind of come to this from an environmental perspective, and I've always been interested in how we manage our resources and waste. Um, and I suppose where I'm really interested in this is when we think about how Scotland has moved since the Industrial Revolution, it's been really focused on extracting natural materials from around the world and using them for this idea of progress. And I think the really exciting thing about degrowth is that it sort of dives into what does progress even mean? What is this idea? Is it making us happier? Is it making us healthier? And kind of critiquing some of those accepted ideologies. Um, so it's a kind of, for me, I'm looking at it from the angle of, is this enlightenment project, which if you think about kind of the Industrial Revolution, it was a civilizing project supposedly and a technological project, but it is all based on the premise that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. And degrowth is really challenging those ideas and saying, well, we can't just continue to grow forever because we only have so much stuff on the planet. And we only have so much resource, which we're very quickly realizing that as soon as we mess with our ecological systems, it comes back to bite us in the form of biodiversity crisis, uh, the climate change crisis, and then all the human impact as well. So poverty, um, the health implications. There's so much tied up with the sort of capitalist project of growth.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I don't know if you can touch a bit about decolonization as well. Like,
Mm.
if you can go a bit on that.
Yeah, so I think from my background, looking specifically at waste and resources, very much of the way that we've managed waste over the past 200 years has been tied up with the colonial project as well from the West. So these ideas that we can just take resources from around the world, use them to advance our own economy, and then send the waste from the end back to the global south and other countries that we've exploited through that process. So I suppose from my point of view, when I was thinking about environmental issues, I was very much coming at it from looking at planetary boundaries, but then you realize that actually so much of the social and political problems that we see from the result of globalization and colonialism is very much tied into the exploitation of the earth as well. So taking materials from other countries for the advancement of the West. Um, so I see those two things as going hand in hand, talking about degrowth and decolonization together.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, I'm learning. I'm learning a lot.
I mean, that's the thing to say as well, that this is a learning process for me because obviously there's so many different angles to come to these problems, and I'm very much focused on the environmental side, but the social side, the climate justice side, there's so many different ways to approach these topics. So yeah, I'm 100% not an expert either. I'm learning as I go.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, we'll move on to question number two. How do you put these ideas into practice in your work or community?
So I mentioned a little bit about the work that I do in the circular economy.
Yes,
And I
yes.
think that's sort of where these concepts come into play for me. So obviously I work in circular economy looking at ways to utilize resources and keep them in play for longer. So that could mean, I think people think that means recycling, and recycling is just one part of the system. But what we really want to get to is reuse and avoidance of waste in the first place. So actually not using as much resources for how we live our lives. At the moment, the statistics show that it's Western countries that are creating the most emissions from their consumption. So we currently live way, way above our planetary boundaries. We are exploiting the earth with the amount of resource that we use for our daily life. So if you're thinking about our cars, we've all got private cars, we've all got foreign holidays, lots of kind of exploitative and very carbon intense hobbies and ways of living. So the work I do is trying to look at how we can reduce our emissions towards a circular economy, keep resources in use, but also actually shift the way that we think about resources and not always thinking about how we get the most, but how we redistribute these resources. And one of the things that's come up a lot in my work is thinking about waste colonialism
Yeah.
as well. So the way that the recycling system is built in Europe at the moment is very much predicated on the idea that we can send our waste to other countries. And the work that I do is thinking about how do we, as sort of supposedly industrialized nations, actually build infrastructure to deal with our own waste. The UK should not be exporting waste. We should be dealing with our domestic waste rather than sending it to countries that maybe don't have the infrastructure to deal with huge amounts of plastic, huge amounts of textiles, all the waste that is being used by the global north and then just being exported to other countries to deal with the problem and clean it up.
Yeah, this is from me. Do you think do you think that we should have more topics around degrowth and decolonization? Sorry, decolonization, or even discussions at your work, for example?
Mm. Oh yeah, 100%. That's something that I've actually brought up with the organization that I work for because we are working with a lot of clients around the world who, governments who are writing policy around dealing with waste. And a lot of the time it's just very technical. It's very focused on how do we move this waste? How do we change the structures of dealing with waste? But there's no conversation about how the system that we've got allows for this to happen. And actually, like, it's a colonial system, isn't it? If you are taking resources from one country, so if we think about cobalt, for example, that we're using in all our technology, that's being mined in, I think it's in the Congo, Dominican Republic of the Congo. That material is then used in everything technological that we use in the West. And then once we don't want our old iPhones anymore, or our old laptops, we're just sending them in containers back to the continent of Africa and just, that whole system is very, very broken, and no amount of kind of changing little bits of the system is going to help. We have to do transformational change and have decolonization at the heart of any like power dynamic around that because it's just exploitative in the very way that we think about the management of resources.
Sometimes even myself, I feel guilty having a mobile phone and looking at
Mm.
these pictures of kids digging those copers and stuff. It's like, yeah, we're all both stuck in this situation where like people don't know some of them where this thing come from, and some of
Mm.
us we know but we do nothing. You know,
But do you know what I think as well, Nico? It's kind of difficult because I think most people know that a phone is made in quite disturbing situation. You know, you've got to mine for that material, and nobody really wants to do that job of mining the materials, the rare earth materials for the phone. But then in the West, there's a pressure to like have a new phone. So
exactly.
you might have a phone that's a bit rubbish, but it's fine, it works. But then you feel this internal pressure and this social pressure to then get rid of that and get a new one. So we're in this horrible sort of paradox where we know it's wrong, we know what's happening is wrong, but as a consumer, we're just like, oh God, but I really want a new iPhone.
Yeah,
So you're in this horrible situation where you know the system is broken, but you're still contributing to it.
yeah. Said even like in those poor countries, their government is not doing anything when it comes to realize and to talk about degrowth, decolonization.
Mm,
There's not much. I think that's the purpose of this podcast, talking to people and trying to raise awareness and as well educating people. Like I'm learning myself today.
mm. And
So
also, I don't think it's the responsibility of the individual. You know, you can do your best in a system, but as you said, like it's governments who are setting the rules of the game, and it's them that have to, you know, we have to put pressure on our governments to change those rules and change the policy. But until that happens, it's very difficult to have an influence as an individual. You know, you can only do as much as you can do in a system that is very broken.
I see, like where I'm from, we used to be the country of lots of tobacco.
Mm,
When the West left, our tobacco is no longer good anymore.
right, okay.
You know what I mean?
So it's Zimbabwe that you're from,
Yep,
and was tobacco like a big export
exactly.
resource? Yeah, yeah.
And as soon the West left, they turn around. Your product is not good. It's not.
Mm,
So that's why when I hear this word decolonization, this thing always comes to my mind. Like, this is how it works.
the impact of the West, I suppose, and then after they've left, the kind of what's left over
Yeah.
is yeah, it's so complicated, but it's really good to have these conversations because I think for me as well, I'm looking at everything from the lens of the global north because that's where I'm working and living, but then I'm trying to understand the impact on other areas of the world from the type of policy we make, specifically about waste, and trying to influence from the work that we do to actually focus on decolonization because it's not something that's at the forefront of policy making.
Yeah. I can imagine. Okay, we'll go to the last question. That's it. We're doing well. The last question is there is a phrase, if it's not just, it's not degrowth. What does this mean to you?
Well, when I saw the questions in advance and I saw that one, I've never heard that phrase. If it's not just, it's not degrowth. So that shows how I'm learning because I didn't know that phrase. Um, but to me, I suppose that means that justice and fairness and sort of critique of the current capitalist ideology has to be at the center of anything that you know, any conversation about degrowth. Because unless we challenge a system that is inherently unfair and unjust, then you're not going to get these changes that we want to see. So again, I'll just bring it back to the environmental perspective for me. We need to reduce our emissions and we need to protect our ecosystems and stop exploiting them. But unless we have a global shift towards more justice for the people who live and work in all these communities that are responsible for creating all the things that we use, then we're not actually going to see that change. We need justice for the workers who produce materials and live in these communities and are being exploited before you can actually see a shift towards changes for the environment and for. So I suppose for me, I'm very much learning about we need to shift towards climate justice for communities around the world before we can see real reduction in emissions and then protection of biodiversity, circular economy. All these things need to be predicated on justice. They can't be, the inherent um, unfairness of our system can't come forward with us into a new low carbon society. We have to change uh, the very structures of capitalism and the exploitative nature of our economic systems.
That, like you mentioned injustice, I can hear that word. Do you think there's a modern slavery right now, or when you look at this, we just talk um about the
Yeah,
yeah. There's a lot of what would you say about what do you see on the modern slavery? Like
yeah, I think
I'll put it this way. So remember, I put it this way. Like for example, when I go to the shops, I can see there's a chills. It says from Sri Lanka. There's a fruit from this
mm,
what places, and I thought maybe that's healthy. But when I think about all these guys pick those fruits that are getting paid nothing,
mm.
you know. So I don't know. As an environmental yourself, I wanted to look at globally the treatment of labor of poor people.
Yeah, that's very pertinent to the work I do as well in waste. So not just, your example about fruit pickers and these supply chains where we're getting stuff from all over the world that isn't in season and what are the conditions for the people producing that. But then you've also got a lot of waste management around the world is collected. The system of collecting waste in a lot of countries that don't have formal infrastructure is through informal waste pickers. So predominantly women who are, working for very, very little money and are responsible for collecting up all these bottles of drinks containers that big multinational companies are creating these drinks. They're selling the drinks into economies without any waste management infrastructure. And then predominantly women are getting paid tiny amounts of money to then collect up all that waste for recycling. So even that system to me is a kind of form of, I don't know if you would call it modern slavery, but it's a very uh, unjust and very shocking way of managing waste because it's these companies that are putting all these plastics into the communities and then there's no sort of formal way of managing that material. And we also see it with the rise of fast fashion and textiles. So not only are we producing huge amounts of waste, plastic waste, but also cotton waste from the amount of textiles that we're consuming, but then you understand that again, predominantly women from the global south are having to work in horrendous conditions to produce our clothes for, they're being sold for a couple of pounds, a £3 t-shirt. And you're thinking, how can you possibly get the resources and then also pay someone a fair living wage to make that product? So I would say 100% when it comes to certain industries, there's definitely some questions around modern slavery. How can that even economically that doesn't make sense? How can you produce a t-shirt for £3 when someone has to be paid fairly to make that t-shirt?
I think that's degrowth comes like if you look at it.
Yeah, like we can't consume that much material, but then also it doesn't because I don't know if you hear this just on textiles specifically. Some people say, oh, but at least people have jobs to make the t-shirts.
Yeah,
And then you think, but that is not a benefit to them to make such a tiny amount of money. We have to, as consumers who buy clothing, we have to be prepared to pay more
yeah,
for better quality material that's going to last a long time. And then that has to then be passed on to the maker of that. And in the middle, there's this big company who's taken the profit and given us both, given the person who bought the t-shirt and the person who made the t-shirt a rubbish outcome. And the person in the middle who took the profit is the only person happy with the system. The rest of us are like, no, that's not good.
Well, like I think when the lockdown finished, when they started ease it down, I used to go to Citizen in Glasgow and I see this queue in
Mm,
Primark. People are queuing outside in Primark
hmm
and they buy clothes every day. I'm thinking, I don't know. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just like, really, you know what I mean? Like, if you look go to that shop and the prices, I know this discussion's been going for years.
mm,
Primark and other cheap shops that they're using poor people in these poor
mm.
communities. And they go west, and then they find it very funny to actually be queuing on the rain. Like,
Yeah, and see, to be honest, like
it's like
I
you're
can see why people do that because that's our culture. Like I would say for myself, when I grew up and I was a teenager, I maybe didn't have a lot of money, and my family didn't have a lot. But when I started making my own money, the first thing I wanted to do was shop.
yeah,
I wanted to go to the cheap shops. I wanted to get lots and lots of clothes. And then it was only as I got kind of older, in my teen years, that I was sort of thinking, why is my hobby shopping? Like, isn't that weird? Buying stuff isn't a hobby. It's just we're made to think in the West that that's like part of your personality. And I think that's why people do this queuing outside and wanting to have the new stuff because the culture is like novelty and you always have to be buying. And actually, like, we've kind of been conditioned, or I don't know, it's like we've been tricked into thinking that we have to buy all the time and consume all the time in order to be a functioning person.
yeah, that's in. Yeah, thank you so much for coming to Degrowth podcast, and yeah, that was great having you.
Thanks, Nico. Thanks for having me.
That's good.